So before we go any further with this concept of integration, let's talk about the spine and a little bit of anatomy review. So the spine consists of 24 separate vertebrae and a few fused vertebrae kind of in our tail region. I'll call that the tail, the lowest part of our spine. And those 24 vertebrae and the 5 fused vertebrae are divided into 4 regions for simple discussion. We have our cervical spine, which is our neck, it's 7 vertebrae. And then we have our kind of trunk area, the thoracic vertebrae, which consists of 12. Our lumbar is our low back, consisting of 5, and we have a sacrum, which is at the base of that spine, and those are those fused vertebrae that kind of connect us to our pelvis. So in a perfect scenario, each of these 24 vertebrae move freely as separate joints, and with just minute differences in movement, and for the purposes of the discussion, we'll just say that across those 24 joints, they should move roughly about the same relative to each other. For example, if we move our spine in a flexion pattern, so kind of like a Halloween cat where you have this rounded spine, we should be able to create a perfect curve from the base of our skull all the way around to our tail. And then we have the same idea for extension. So in the opposite direction, you have this curve from the head, and it curves down, and then it dips back, comes back up in that tail. So that's in an ideal and perfect situation right here. And sometimes for whatever reason, regions of our spine become stiff and kind of difficult to move. And then remember from our sports analogy from our integration video that when one part of the body under contributes, the other areas will compensate and tend to over contribute, okay? And when this happens, we get, again, kind of that overworking area that potentially could cause issues. And so let's take a common example here. This happens often when the thoracic spine, so that midsection of your back, when the thoracic spine becomes rigid, and this rigidity requires more movement above and below to compensate for the lack of movement in the mid. So more movement in the cervical and more movement in the lumbar spine to compensate for the thoracic rigidity. In the case of movements requiring a lot of thoracic rotation, like a golf swing or a tennis serve or a tennis hit, if the thoracic is not mobile enough to create that rotation or contribute well to that rotation, the rotation will then mostly happen above and below the thoracic, right? So if it's rigid in the middle, you're not going to be able to rotate, so above and below will compensate. So this happens then in the lumbar and the cervical spine. And if you think about it, it's kind of crazy that all of that force is being located in just 5 vertebrae, instead of being distributed across all 24 joints. And so over movement, especially if it's not controlled or supported by muscle tissue, this over movement or over contribution can cause some issues in our trouble spots. And so in this case of your tight thoracic spine, our goal would be to mobilize thoracic spine and create some stability, both in anti-rotation and rotational stability in the core to support the lumbar spine. And then you could also say that you would want to increase your mobility and strength in hips too. That would help pick up some of the slack as well. And this increased flexibility and strength in your hip rotation in particular can decrease the demands of rotation in the spine during powerful rotational movements in golf and tennis, all right? And so this kind of goes with the idea of the concept of integration that we discussed before. We want to get the whole spine moving and supported in a way so that one of the players on the team doesn't have to pick up the slack.